You are listening to IBGR, the International Business Growth Radio Network. My name is William Eastman. I'm host for today's show, and this show is broken down into 4 segments. We're going to be talking about segment 2. The name of the show is New World Business Economics. Okay? Now, I shorthand that whole thing because I wanted to get the title in so I could do stuff with it like Twitter and that other garbage. So it's Neo World, like Matrix, which I'm getting excited about seeing the new Matrix movie. And so what are we talking about today? Well, in the first segment, and we're not going to cover it again, you're going to have to go back and get that podcast to listen to it. But I basically laid the groundwork for how governments operate and the impact of bad government policy on economics, okay? And the way to look at it is government almost never can do anything additive that helps. Government helps by being subtractive. What I mean by that is unless it's a brand new government that never existed before, then you could say, well, we could add policies and rules and laws and make it better. The deal is that government is already too involved in economies. Now, I have a particular view of economics. You will hear that today. You can agree or disagree with me. But if you're an entrepreneur, you're a small business owner, and you disagree with my view of economics, it's going to cost you seriously in your business. That's a lock. All right, so you need to go to the website, ibgr.network. That's IBGR, the International Business Growth Radio Network. When you get there, go over to resources, mouse over that. You'll see show notes. Click show notes. If you're listening to this live, then you'll see right at the top of the queue, Neo World, N-E-O, World Business Economy Show number 1, Spotting BS. All right? If, in fact, it's not there because you're listening to this later on, go to the search bar on every page, put that information in Neo, N-E-O, World Biz Economic Show 1, and up it will pop. Now, I'm in segment 2, which corresponds to podcast number 2, this one here. Okay, and this one is now, okay, when did economics become a science? Now, a lot of people call it the dismal science, and there's some reason for that, but let me call it a science, all right? Economics were not invented, not created, or discovered. Adam Smith gets kind of the credit for this because he's the first to look at it in a systematic way and define it. And that term became called capitalism. And because they used the word capital to identify what the currency of exchange, all right, how are we going back and forth? And as a business owner, I have to form capital to start a company, money, resources, and to grow my company. So that's how I got the name of capitalism. All right, so, and he did this, it's interesting enough, is he did this in 1776 because when the founders started the United States, they didn't have an economic model. They didn't have, okay, well, we're going to do this or this. I'm willing to say that they were Luddites when it came to economics, but as you read, if you're familiar with American history, probably Alexander Hamilton is the only one who kind of got it in terms of when it comes to economic theory. But it didn't exist. In other words, Adam Smith's the one who basically defined it. And that's really interesting. And I'm going to tell you how he defined it and why it's superior to anything else. Other than a few local examples where you had maybe barter, people are bartering shells for fish, or goods that they've made between, say, Native American tribes. Most countries were involved in some sort or form of mercantilism. That's the name that was given at the time. Now, how does this work? Well, it's basically how France built an empire, how Spain built an empire, how Portuguese built an empire. But the empire of empires is the British Empire. And how did they do that? Well, they did it by conquering these countries, extracting their raw materials, bringing it back to the mother country, manufacturing it by adding value, and then selling it back to everybody else. Now, you don't have to be a colonizer to do that. It's the strategy that mainland China is currently using as well. But here's the premise behind it. And it is, in some ways, sound thinking. It just doesn't turn out to be true. And remember that kind of one-liner, because later on when I talk about command economies, which is 2 podcasts away or 2 segments away, is that in economics, your intention doesn't matter. It's the behaviors that you see that matters, and that's why some systems work and others do not. Okay? And so here's the premise, and that was that exporting was good and importing was bad. Why? Because of the transfer of wealth. I got this gold, I've got whatever we're using as kind of our reserve currency or our reserve capital. And so the more that the country can bring in and preserve within its boundaries, whether it's the government has it or businesses have it or individuals have it, but the richer the country would become richer, the more money that it retained. And if it became a net importing country, then wealth would go out. Now, fundamentally, there's not a lot wrong with that concept because it is somewhat true. But Adam Smith looked at that and said, well, we've got to define wealth differently. And so this great kind of Scottish philosopher is the one who put the kind of the mark in the sand, the line in the sand, and said, okay, let's analyze this in a systematic fashion, and let's see how it works and what works best. All right. Now, somebody else may have done it before Adam Smith in 1776. I have no idea who it is. Okay. So understand that, first of all, Adam Smith was a philosopher. At his core, he was not an economist because that really didn't exist. He was a philosopher. And in fact, his first book that he wrote that's widely published was on the morality of markets. In other words, he came to this interesting conclusion by living in Edinburgh, Scotland, a Scottish Presbyterian. In fact, most people say that capitalism is the curse that the Presbyterian Scots put on the rest of the world. I think it's kind of a great thing that they've done, but that's different. That's a different conversation. And he watched how businesses flourished or they failed. And what he said here is that the social order, really good social order, how good societies do good things or how good societies act, is this idea of that there's an underlying morality to the market. In other words, number one, it's a voluntary exchange. You are not forced to buy from me, and I'm not forced to sell to you. Number one. Number two, nobody comes in and tells us what the terms of the agreement are. So I talk to you, you talk to me, we go back and forth, we barter, and then finally we come to an agreement of how much value as the buyer I should give you in the form of currency for how much value as the supplier you created in whatever it is that you're selling to me. And that is totally a voluntary transaction. Now, here's where the morality comes in. The morality comes in fact, that these have to be not only voluntary exchanges, but based on truth. In other words, I cannot really lie as a supplier. Well, I can do that, but I'll get to that in a minute. But if I lie a lot, if I get a reputation for being an unreputable or unscrupulous supplier, nobody's going to buy from me, and I don't care what the pricing is. On the other hand, is that if let's say we don't buy cash on the barrelhead, but let's say we buy on time and there's a contract, and maybe I pay it phased pieces, and I don't pay on time, then I become somebody who has, we say in modern terms, no credit. So therefore, nobody will lend to me. And so there was a certain morality to this. And those of you who study psychology, this is kind of in many ways what Carl Jung was getting at 100 years later with his kind of collective consciousness, that there seems to be symbols out there that mean the same thing to everybody. So therefore, there's more to this than meets the eye. And so he looked at this and said, his first book was called The Sentiment of Markets. And he looked at morality of how people exchanged and did business together and what made up a good society. Then he wrote The Wealth of Nations, which was in a way of saying, okay, let's talk about this strictly, well, not strictly, but let's talk about it predominantly from an economic perspective. And so his thing was that social order is based on maximum amount of freedom. And that's how good societies act. And coming out of that, though he didn't write this, I want to introduce the concept that there are three basic economic models out there. Now, there are a tremendous number of variations to it because this is why it's called a dismal science. It's not like physics. I can take out a set of calipers and I can measure it in terms of getting its circumference. I can put it on scale and get a weight, and whether I'm using English system or imperial system, or I'm using metrics, there's a standard there. And then now I have a fact that I can base it upon. Here, it's a little bit different. But here's how I want you to look at it, because this is where we're going to go next. And that is, there are market-based economies, there are command-based economies, and there are mixed economies. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take in the next segment, so you've got to come back for this because this is going to be one of my favorites. Well, my favorite in the positive. The last one is my favorite in terms I get to rail. We're going to talk about a market-based economy and why that is superior. In fact, kind of my title that I have for myself here at the radio station, or I should say within the network, is that I'm an entrepreneurial capitalist. In other words, I look at entrepreneurial capitalism because only a market-based country that operates predominantly on market-based principles is going to have a vibrant small business entrepreneurial world. These other systems may work for big corporations or people that love government, but if you're a small business owner, those other forms, command economy, mixed economy, they don't work so good for you. And that is really the essence of where I'm going with this. Now, let me see here. I got about a little more than a minute and a half left. So, and where I want to do is kind of seed where we're heading with this. You're going, okay, I didn't really want to sign up for economics class. Well, trust me, you're not really signing up for econ class. I'm arming you to fight the enemies of commerce. I'm arming you to fight the enemies of free enterprise. I'm arming you to fight the enemies of entrepreneurship. I'll be here to arm you to fight the enemies of success, really, when you really get down to it. And so this week, I'm handling this in 4 segments. Next week, I'm going to tell you how to take a look at the economy in the broadest terms, and based upon where the economy is, what you should be doing as a business owner, and what's going to happen next. And of course, then, that's just an overview. Then we're going to build that out for the remainder of the shows. All these shows, either here live at IBGR or as a podcast, I'm going to break it down. There is no reason why you don't need to outrun the bear, like I talked about in the first segment. All you need to do is outrun the competition. Let the bear catch your competitors. You put on your tennis shoes, you outrun every one of your competitors, and not only are you going to be here as the next downturn comes through the economy, you're going to come out of this stronger and better, and that's where we're going to take it. All right, so let me take you to break. You're listening to IBGR, the International Business Growth Radio Network. My name is William Eastman. I'm a host for today's show. This show, or podcast, depending upon how you're getting it, is Neo World Business Econ Show. In other words, New World Business.